Welcome to Mindfulness Manufacturing, the podcast for manufacturing leaders and professionals.
Designed for high impact on your way to work or unwind on your way home to gain clarity for tomorrow.
Step out of your comfort zone and discover new perspectives to add value, get results, and make a difference.
Yes, let's jump in.
Well, as much as we love our listeners, we do a lot of listening ourselves to different podcasts, and that's how we learn. One of my favorites is Simon Sinek. And recently he had on Sara Blakely, and wow, she is amazing. Great conversation between the two. And what I really took out of it was sales. And she sold fax machines for 7 years, doing some cold calling. And she said it was one of the best things you could ever do, just what you learn. And in manufacturing, when we think about it, we're doing a lot of selling. You see that, Dave?
Man, absolutely. I mean, everything we do, we're selling. We're selling our immediate supervisor the idea of break schedules, parts, material supply, and having to justify, say, convince, persuade. Everything we do all day long, whether you're in manufacturing or not, it's all about selling your ideas, selling your thoughts, selling your initiative, selling, not yourself, because that may have a negative connotation, but yeah, ultimately you're selling yourself.
Every interaction that we have with people, it's a transaction, right? And we've talked about this on podcasts before, and you're right, Dave, it's not being manipulative. It's just knowing, having that end in mind and being that connected person. And so this whole business that we do now, that's one thing that I really had to transfer that skill of, like, that selling within a building, like within a manufacturing plant, and then being able to articulate what you're feeling and what you're trying to get to. So there's one person I go to when I need advice on that, and it's Jeff Summers from Genos International. And Dave actually introduced me to Jeff many years ago, which is, this podcast would not have come around probably without that interaction. So it's two great people that have influenced my life on the podcast today. And welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, guys. I'm looking forward to it. This is awesome. And I've heard the Sara Blakely thing with the Simon Sinek too, Trevor, and you're spot on. It was great.
Yeah. So Jeff, what was one of those moments that, got you into this space? And so what's an example, maybe something that from your past that kind of share with the listeners of how you got into this space of emotional intelligence and sales, and how does that all come together for you?
Oh gosh, great question, Trevor. It's interesting, and you know this, and Dave, you know this, that the term emotional intelligence hasn't been around that long, but really, truly, the underpinnings of it have been around forever, and communication is communication. So I'm going to go back and share a story that was my first really experience. We didn't call it emotional intelligence. We didn't have the terms at the time, but it really made a lasting effect on me. And it goes back to 1989. And I lived at the time in the Quad Cities, for anybody listening that's familiar with John Deere. And I am not a technical person. I'm not a car person, but it was really my first venture into buying a new vehicle. So my brother Bruce and I set up a plan, and we had planned to visit 3 different car dealerships on a Saturday. And I remember it like it was yesterday. And we made our first appointment to a dealership, and it was decent. The person was very knowledgeable in features and benefits, and it went like you would think it would go. Nothing special, nothing good, nothing bad. And we left, and we went to another dealership, and kind of the same thing. Individual came up, and it was features, benefits. And the third place was in Rock Island, Illinois, and I can see it. It's no longer there. A place called Campbell Olds, and the salesperson's name was Mark. And again, very knowledgeable person, and we were going through some things. And Mark said something at one point, and it's really strange. It's this one statement could stick for so long that really made an impact. And this, go back a little bit. If you guys are car guys, and I'm not, but back in the late 80s, that's when all the electronics and the computer and the speedometer went to electronic. And Mark said, before you go, we're all dealing with some of these challenges with electronics and computers and chips, and cars sometimes stall and those things happen. And he said, we're no different. It's not perfect. We've had some challenges like everybody else. But what I'd like to do, Jeff, he said, is I'd like you to come into our service department and meet Gary. Just in case you purchase a vehicle here, I want you to see what our service department looks like and meet that individual. And there was a different kind of vibe going on, and I couldn't put a finger on it. But long and short of it, I ended up purchasing the vehicle from Mark that day. And everything else being equal, the vehicles and the sales, the strategies and the features and the benefits. But he did something that day that was different. And we now call it authenticity or vulnerability or being transparent. But he wasn't perfect. And he said, we've been having some challenges with this, but here's what we're going to do. And there was that trust that happened. So at that point in time, I didn't know what that was called, and we didn't have that information. At some point, we, with neuroscience and things, but that made a huge impact. And I always thought about that because, everybody else you hear about always be closing. So that one really, Trevor and Dave, played a big part in me understanding that there's a different way to approach it. And you know how it is even today, but there's so many things back in the day of you got to be perfect. You got to have an answer for every objection. You can't show any weakness. You can't show that you don't have an answer. And there was hundreds and hundreds of books and methodologies, but why did that person do that? And did I feel comfortable? So to answer your question, that was really the story that got me moving in that direction.
Always closing. That means like never being present and never listening. Just close. It's like, oh my goodness. And
that makes you want to grab them by the throat and punch them in the face. It's just.
When we think about those relationships that we develop, and I think about working with the tool maker just to get a move done. And yeah, I'm thinking about maybe some bad welds getting through and we need to make an adjustment. We need to stop the line and get the right skill set in there. But really it always went well when I already had a relationship and some type of vulnerability on my side with that tool maker, that he knew that, or she knew that some way we were a little bit similar.
Right.
I mean, when you say Trevor, I already had a relationship. Some people put that in the category of the good old boy network or sucking up. The difference is a relationship built on transparency, vulnerability, like Jeff said, authenticity. That's what cuts through the noise. That's when it gets real. And it's not about the good old boy network. It's about, wow, this guy cares. This person, this lady really has my best interest. I mean, we're all in this together. It's not about the relationship, the good old boy network.
Yeah. And that's a great clarification, Dave, in the fact of authenticity does not mean I show up one way for the good old boys club. And then, if I need something from you, then I'm going to be different. That's just the opposite. It's kind of like, so now you need something. And now you're showing up like I'm part of the club. I don't think so.
Well, Jeff, what kind of car did you buy that day?
You know what, Dave? I bought a Cutlass Supreme, and I did have it in the shop a fair amount with the computer issue. So long and short of it, it was a good thing I met Gary that day and the service manager. But funny you asked, it was a Cutlass Supreme that did have a lot of glitches because it was all that just transferring over at that point. There was another, actually, and I had never shared the story, but you just triggered something. Back in from 90 to 96, I had worked in a staffing industry. And then beyond that, I worked in an assessment space and doing personality profiling. And you remind me of a story that I had thought about in years. But in the same city, we worked with an assessment tool. And you guys are familiar, but it's, I don't need to name it, but it's one of those tools where you go in and you look at high-performing salespeople, managers, and once the organization gives you the superstars, you assess them and you create a grid or a model so they can hire to that. And it's usually when it's salespeople, you get your best people, you assess them and you look at the common traits and you build a model, and it's built on personality. Well, in the same city, when I got into that business, I was at the largest car dealership at the time. And there was an individual that was the #1 car salesperson, not only for that dealership, but he was like a rock star in the whole community. And I never met him personally. Well, we go to build, they were a client, they were like one of my first clients. We go to build a success benchmark, and he was not on the list of people to be assessed for the pattern. And at that point, I didn't know. So I always thought it was kind of strange. And I asked, why wasn't he? And they could never put a finger on it, but they said, this individual was great to their clients and they loved him. They sold a lot of cars, they got referrals, but the damage this person did internally, they didn't even want to think about the number of people that left the organization, the toxicity. And again, they didn't call it emotional intelligence, but I forgot about that story. But so here's the #1 superstar salesperson in a whole community that was not included in the benchmark. They couldn't put a finger on it, but it wasn't a personality issue that they should have been included now in hindsight, but it was all the damage that this person did internally with their own organization. So I had forgotten about that, but Dave, you said something about the car and it reminded me of that dealership. So again, it was not a personality issue. It was an EI issue, but it's just an interesting story after all those years. The best person in that role was not added. They didn't have any good reason. They just didn't want any more of them. And yet this person sold the most cars in the area.
What a connection to today, fast forward, because a lot of the skills, and again, I think a lot of the stories of the things I said and some of the damage that I caused, maybe around that same time period. And I feel for that person because, there's so much stimulation that we just don't stop to reflect, right? If it's sales and just trying to do this, or just trying to accomplish these goals through other people, and we just don't stop and we don't have that moment to reflect. And just by having that ability for someone to say, hey, you know what? You're really kind of like trampling over your peers, dude. Like you're in a short-term game, but really this is an infinite game, as Simon would say, and you're missing out. And man, I wish I had somebody that could have helped me coach me somehow back then. And so I can definitely relate to that salesperson. And fortunately, I'm here with you two today, and I've gotten good feedback from you two over the years.
I've got a very similar story, Jeff. I mean, I worked for a guy that absolutely was adored by the workforce at large, but those that were his direct reports and closest to him in the business, man, you talk about leaving a wake of bodies in his trail. And he would cuss you up one side down the other and just let you have it. And then that Jekyll and Hyde, he goes out into the manufacturing floor and he puts a smile on his face, and people are like, I love this guy, right? And his direct associates were sitting there rolling their eyes saying, man, if you only knew, but the guy got results. And Trevor, to your point, man, they were short term, relatively speaking. They weren't long term. They weren't the kind that legacies were built on. They were the kind that got you to the end of the month, end of quarter results. But when that guy ultimately got fired, the house came crumbling down. And because there was no substance left in the growth and development of those in and around him. It was just survival mode
around that, because I'm curious. You brought up something, and I wonder if it was a command and control style that this person felt that was the way there, and they had the EI, but they thought maybe the command and control out. And I think back to Trevor, you mentioned always be closing. There was probably a lot of people back in the day that had emotional intelligence, but it was drilled in there who they were to call people and say, hey, hey, Dave, I'm Jeff Summers. It's tomorrow at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock going to be fine. Where it almost sounds like this person, Dave, that had shown up around a lot of people one way, but I just wonder if their skill set was, if they were trained on command and control, and they thought that's how you get the most out of people. It's an interesting, when you said that they were able to turn it on and turn it off, but yet it's just interesting. It was just an interesting story.
Yeah, there was a small group of folks that introduced me to the concept of meet a narcissist.
Wow.
It's like, I don't know. I mean, there was some narcissistic behavior there that at the end of the day, Jeff, it may be deeper and beyond emotional intelligence. So it was interesting. I mean, what a great experience.
So Jeff, we talk about in leadership and manufacturing, there's always pressure. You're only as good as the last hour. And it's almost like this expectation of being a superhero, and that we're always just trying to get these things accomplished. And we're basically, we're selling. And so what advice do you have when people feel that superhero expectation and really to get a better result, to be a little more open and humble, you can get a better result? What would you say to people wearing the cape?
My first thought was when you described that, Trevor, was I'm guessing that kind of person lacks the ability to empower others. So some of it's, and I hate to pick on young first-time managers, but I'm guessing a lot of production managers, for instance, this is their first time leading and managing individuals. So it's natural for them to go from the player as the production person to become the manager. And now all of a sudden what's happening is they think that they need to have all the answers. They don't delegate. And it's not a malicious thing. It's not who they are, but they think that the way to management and leadership is to do it all on their own. And that's what's going to get them there. And then when you learn, you pull back and you alienate people around you. And all of a sudden you have people that don't feel empowered. They lack their any of that purpose. So in my mind, the part of authenticity that's great is once you realize you can get more done through others than by yourself, it's a step in the direction of just saying, hey, I can let my guard down a little bit. It's not a bad thing. And once I start to do and become familiar with some of my own strengths and weaknesses and self-awareness, get to know the people around me and my team and really what makes them tick. Now all of a sudden, instead of one person trying to do it all, you have one person that's really the CEO or the overseer of a bunch of talented individuals.
Sounds like a lot of effort sometimes to put a square block into that round hole, where it's like, you can just be a round hole. You can just be you can be the round block and just be yourself. It's so much easier. It's not as stressful. And it's just funny how sometimes by having less effort and having less answers, you get greater results, because it's not about the ego. And it is that authenticity. It's like, dude, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. That's my role. And there's experts in this building. And we're going to figure it out.
Trevor, and I'm going to share, we've talked about this, I think, but it's kind of an off, I'll let my ADD take over a little bit here with a squirrel story that will relate to this. But authenticity, part of it, and a big part of it is showing up as your real self and who you are, and talking about Sara Blakely in that podcast. And people relate to that and feel comfortable. And I'll share another little story, but part of that new manager, new leader there and what they think they need to do, and the stress and the pressure and anxiety, and it just keeps building. This is kind of just a true story. Back in, I think it was like 2000 and maybe one, I was doing a John Deere conference where I was doing a number of speaking engagements over a 2-week period to a group of John Deere dealership employees, dealer principals, and there was like 60, 70 people, and it was in Reno, Nevada. And I grew up with horrible bloody noses, like nobody's business being rushed to the hospital. So I knew, unfortunately, I was an expert in bloody noses because I grew up with them. And the reason I even bring this up is when you're in Reno in the winter, it's very dry. So on the first morning, I was scheduled to do a whole series of these talks. I was nervous. I mean, period. I woke up that morning with a bloody nose that just would not quit. And anxiety, anxious. Even if I was at home on a Saturday morning, it was kind of stressful. But all I could think about is, I'm going to be in 2 hours up on a stage in front of 60, 70 people, and I'm going to be doing it 2 or 3 times. What if it starts to bleed when I'm up there? And I could feel the pressure and the stress mounting. So for some reason, I don't know why I did it, but I did it. It was one of the greatest things, and it was an authentic moment. But I got up on the first group, and I'm looking out, and I see these 60, 70 people. And I just said, before we get started, I pulled out a bunch of tissues in my pocket. I told that same story. I'm like, I had a horrible bloody nose. I didn't get into all the details, but I said to the group, I said, you might be at your first, training where the person being the presenter has a bloody nose, and it lightened it up. But I did it for me because I felt the stress, the tension. What if I do it? As soon as I said that, that was not for me to connect with them. That was for me to get the pressure off of me. So coming back to what you're talking about, Trevor, now circling back to that leader, part of that pressure, I've got to be perfect. I got to be perfect. When you start to drop your guard, not only are you connecting and building those relationships, but all of a sudden now the ability to be a little vulnerable lightens the load on your back. And now you can breathe a little easier. So, and coming back to the story about the John Deere thing, it was almost like, I wish I had said at the beginning of every one, because people came by, hey, how the next couple of days, like, how's your nose? It became kind of a conversation piece. But I learned my lesson that day, that especially in front of a group of people, that if you're nervous, sometimes just to give a little, you don't have to get personal information, but to say you're nervous and be a little vulnerable and professional can not only make you connect better with them, but it comes back twofold in your ability to loosen some of that anxiety.
I think Brene Brown would like that one, Jeff. That question always comes up of what is the right amount of sharing? You want collaboration, you want cooperation. Well, it starts with you being authentic and being vulnerable. It's when they go up on stage and say, I'm really nervous about speaking today and I'm worried about screwing up. Well, okay, that's probably not how you want to start it. But what you just described, that is authenticity. I mean, that would be one where I could see that gold stamp and the fact of, yeah, that's it. It's like, don't try to pretend that the nose issue isn't there. Just be open about it. I mean, that's something that could happen, and it ends up being a conversation piece, and they probably connected with you because of that right off the hop.
Absolutely. And when we throw around the big words, authenticity, vulnerability, transparency, everybody today knows what a mask is, right? The mask is on, the mask is off, whatever. Okay. Well, when you take that mask off, the freedom that you experience, and Jeff, you just described, look, you took the mask off, you made it known, hey, here's what you may, I'm your first guy you may ever see on stage with a bloody nose. You took the mask off, and what did you experience?
Freedom for me, but you know what? The intent was to get the pressure off of me in that moment, Dave. But what I found is it made I looked like a real person to them. And that really wasn't the goal. I needed to get loosened up a little bit. That was the only thing I could do to get rid of that tension.
But you experienced freedom that enabled the rest of the audience to experience the real you, and you probably did one of your best presentations that day because that ice was broken, the wall was down, the mask was off.
Yep. 100% right.
Hopefully others that are listening can kind of have that reflection of, hey, it's okay today if I tell someone I don't know. And it's okay today if I'm a little bit more like myself and be a little kinder to me. And let's see how people respond to that. Jeff, take this back to selling and how we interact with people. What's an example or something moving forward that you can kind of tell to leave the listeners with and relate to you?
You teed me up. Thank you, Trevor. I'm going to pick on you a little bit.
All right.
For those of you that know or don't know Trevor, he's a huge Minnesota Vikings fan. And I was thinking about, I wanted to talk about awareness of others and empathy and that kind of thing. But I thought I'd have a little fun, Trevor and Dave, and pick on and use kind of a little analogy that would reflect empathy or awareness of others as it relates to sales. So imagine that you're moving to Detroit, Michigan, Trevor. You're a Vikings fan. And let's say that I am, in kind of a fun way, I am I sell season tickets. I sell tickets for both the Lions and the baseball team. Let's just assume they're owned by both.
All right.
And, but my commission for some reason or other is a bigger draw if I sell a season ticket to the Lions games than there's the Tigers. If I go in to a call and Trevor is a Viking fan, and I go in because I want to sell you the Lions season tickets, and I don't really get to know Trevor, and I go in there and I try to sell and nothing happens. What I don't realize, if I was a high, let's just say, awareness of others person, experience it, I would go in and I would very quickly realize Trevor is a lifelong Vikings fan. He's the person that when they lose a close game on a Sunday evening, probably doesn't sleep well Sunday night going into Monday morning. So the reason that empathy and awareness of others is so important, when you really get with your prospects, when you understand where they're coming from, and you really get to know and you peel the layers back. And in this case, it wouldn't take too long before I would figure out, wait a second, Trevor is not going to be a Lions season ticket holder. Maybe I can sell him a package to the suite when they play the Vikings at home, but maybe I'm better off going in to another direction and selling Trevor a Detroit, Tigers pass. So when someone has such a strong belief, and going back to your Martha Clark, when she talked about belief and actions and outcomes in your podcast, that it's hard to change that belief. And when you have awareness of others and you're in sales and you really get to know what's important to an individual. And again, if you were a Vikings fan, you said, Jeff, I just became a Vikings fan. I watch other teams. I like football, period. Different story. But when you get to the emotional connection that someone has to something, and you get down deep and you understand it, it changes the way you direct your efforts in presenting and how you present. But if you just go in with what I'm going to tell and share, once you don't know enough where they're coming from, I just think, again, going back to that Martha Clark, that was that piece that she talked about with that connection and that loop. I listened to over and over again, because it's about when you have a belief in something someone does, it's not what you know, features and benefits, what you can get to know about that person and really understand where they're coming from a deep level.
That outcome in mind. And hey, if the Vikings were playing on Thanksgiving Day and you told me that might be just enough. Or I am a Wings fan, so maybe there's a tie in there. But yeah, it's that simple connection. It's like you start talking about Red Wings, you start talking about Vikings are there on Thanksgiving. Then I could have been, not even thinking about that, and lean right into it. I love that, Jeff. Anytime I can bring up the purple people eaters. Final thoughts, Dave?
I am stunned with the outpouring of love for the Vikings and the Red Wings. Come on.
Mom was born in Minnesota, raised close to Detroit. So that's the connection.
Yeah.
So appreciate that, Jeff. That's been great discussion today. This is exactly what we all need, is these thoughts around, hey, we're always in a transactional mode with people. And by just like, I love the way you end that, right? Learn about them. Like, I'm even thinking right now about that tool maker. Like, if I could just think a little bit more about what's important to him in his craft, what's what's the right setup to say that, yeah, this is how we should run the line, Trevor. And I need your support. Okay, well, let's work together. So if we work together with that, get that outcome in mind, relate to each other. I love it, Jeff. Great stories. And so grateful to have you on. Thanks for sharing today.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thanks for taking the time to join us today. How you show up matters.
We'd love for you to subscribe, share with a colleague, and tell us what you think.
Your feedback's important to provide this high-quality, powerful program that makes a difference in your life and others. Take care.
See you next time.